As 1965 began, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was at its height, and space had become the perfect theater of competition in order to help set the perceptions around the world about which superpower was technologically stronger and which philosophy would prevail. The race to the moon was to be the ultimate challenge for both of these superpowers. The Soviet space program was so far ahead of the Americans in the race to the moon at that time that few people even hoped that the first footprints on the moon would belong to an American. That was all about to change. Project Gemini, the second in a three-part program to ultimately land an American on the moon, was about to begin and turn the tables on the Soviet Union. President Kennedy's bold challenge to land a man on the moon and safely return him to Earth accelerated the race to an unprecedented level. If the Americans were to capture the clear lead in space, a staggering amount of work would have to be accomplished in a very short time. Unfortunately, technology was lagging far behind vision. Equipment, systems, and procedures still had to be invented, developed, and finally tested in space by real astronauts in real time. As Project Gemini was about to begin in early 1965, the American Space Agency, NASA, had only completed Project Mercury, which involved only 2 15-minute suborbital flights and 4 solo flights in Earth orbit totaling less than 54 hours. The Russians, on the other hand, had by then performed rendezvous missions between 2 capsules, launched a 2-man and a 3-man crew, conducted a successful spacewalk, sent up the first female cosmonaut, and set the duration record in space of almost 5 days. By all accounts, the Russians were the clear favorites in the race to the moon.
The Soviet threat, if you will, in the Cold War provided an enormous motivation for those of us that were in the NASA program. Personally, I looked upon this as just another battle in the Cold War. My friends were fighting in Vietnam. I happened to be fighting a more peaceful war in space. And there was an enormous motivation on the parts of everybody to overcome the leadership that the Soviets had demonstrated in space and to get to the moon first.
As we began to think about the challenge of going to the moon with Apollo, and as we began to examine the relatively simple experience and hardware that we had engaged and used in the Mercury program, we realized that there was a major gap in terms of our capability and our ability to deal with all the operational questions that would have to be addressed in order to successfully land on the moon and come back.
You got to remember, Mercury was not a maneuverable vehicle. It could go up and come down, and that's all. It had no maneuvering capability. So that was the first thing we wanted to do, was maneuver. The second thing we wanted to do was, could it go find somebody up there? Could it go do a job up there? Could it go rendezvous with something? Could it go dock with something? Could you attach a rocket to it and go to someplace else? Those were all the things we were thinking about when we came to Gemini.
There were 4 major objectives of the Gemini program. Computer-controlled re-entry to improve guidance that would contribute to return from the moon guidance. That was one objective. Rendezvous of spacecraft was another objective, so that we could do lunar orbit rendezvous to come back from the moon. That was a major objective. long-duration flight so that we could assure that the human could exist comfortably or at least survive up to 2 weeks, which was the longest possible lunar mission that we might have. That was another objective. The final objective of the Gemini program, number 4, was space walking, or EVA. So we could convince ourselves that we could build the spacesuits and the human could operate independent of the spacecraft on the lunar surface. So all those 4 objectives really bridged the gap between Mercury and Apollo.
After 2 unmanned test flights, the first piloted Gemini capsule, Gemini 3, was finally launched on March 23, 1965, for a 3-orbit flight around the Earth. America was back in the space race to the moon.
Gus Grissom and I were on Gemini 3, the first flight of the Gemini. It was to prove that we could do maneuvers in space, manual maneuvers in space, with a translation controller, which you didn't have the capability of doing that, and do all the things you had to do to make those orbital maneuvers so you could rendezvous, and also to prove out lifting and re-entry, and we proved it out.
Back in Gemini, we didn't have onboard television, and we actually did not have full-time communications with the vehicle. We had little tracking stations, and if you've ever seen a map of the world that we used, it was defined by little circles, you know, around Hawaii and Guam, and a couple of places in Australia, Mexico, a couple of places in the US, out in the Atlantic. And our whole life, in terms of communicating with the crew, keeping track of what was going on, solving problems, and continuing to meet mission objectives, was constrained to living with these little 5 minutes worth of communication blocks.
We had the usual problems. Gus worked more than 12 different tests of the flight control system and checked it out very well, and we were having some problems with the way the gyro compassing system aligned the platform at night and horizon sensors in it. But they were the normal kind of problems you have. The real serious problem that we had was that we found out we had a 30% reduction in the lift-to-drag ratio, which is why we landed 60 miles short of the target. We would have landed, doing the entry, we would have landed 190 miles short, but Gus made up all but 130 miles of it, so it's great.
With any new technology, there are bound to be surprises. Not only were the re-entry calculations incorrect, but tests were never really conducted to determine the effect on the crew once the parachutes came out.
The parachutes opened and it pitched Gus and I both forward into the windscreen, into the face panels. We were very close anyway, so it pitched us both forward, and Gus actually cracked his visor, and I hit pretty hard too, and I guess we overcame that by having our seat belts really cinched down good in the later flights. It still pitched everybody forward, but they're ready for it.
Preparing for the moon also meant testing human endurance outside the spacecraft. This would include performing an extravehicular activity known as an EVA, as well as testing the integrity of the spacesuit. Successful completion of these activities were to be the main goals of Gemini 4.
Myself and Larry Bell and several other crew members came in, and we developed what we called Plan X. Plan X was Alan Shepard was one of the principal crewmen in this. Plan X, which was a plan for the first United States EVA, and we were going to do it on the Gemini 4 mission. We'd do this hush-hush after hours. Everybody would leave work, and we'd go into the altitude chamber, and we'd sit down and plot and plan and study. And we sent a series of sealed instructions out. There was a very small group that knew we were going to try to conduct an EVA. We had to get agreement from the White House.
Gemini 4 was launched on June 3rd with astronauts Ed White and James McDivitt. and the highlight came when White floated into space and performed the first American spacewalk.
When we started on the front end, EVA looks very easy because it's a free-floating kind of a thing. There aren't any real difficult, things are relatively light because they're in this zero-gravity environment. Crew members can move things around, and we thought nothing of just having people go outside and kind of wander around and do whatever they had to do and get back in the spacecraft.
Thought, what do you say to 194 million people when you're looking down at them from space? And this flashed through my head as I got out. I had thought about it before. They had cautioned me, said, you're going to be on live radio and live TV. And I honestly couldn't think of what I really should say. And the solution became very obvious to me as I stepped out. I said, they don't want me to talk to them from up here. They want to hear what we're doing up here while we're actually going through the missions.
No one really talked about that much, publicly at least. But Ed White had a nightmare trying to fit himself back in that seat. And this of course, was made easier as time went on by techniques to tighten the straps and get back into position. And then, even then, it was almost impossible to get in the right position for re-entry until you started feeling some gravity. Then you could sort of squiggle in and get your harness tight again.
White's short stroll lasted only 22 minutes, but it proved that an astronaut could survive and potentially perform useful tasks in space. The entire mission lasted over 4 days and finally closed the gap with the Russians. However, it still remained to be proven whether humans could function for a length of time commensurate with the planned duration of future moon missions. Newly invented onboard computers and fuel cells had yet to be tested. These were the goals of Gemini 5, with astronauts Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad.
Gemini 5 had the first all-up computer. It had the first fuel cell. It had the first rendezvous radar. It had a number of systems that were brand new that had to be developed, had to be tested and developed. And of course, it was the first one to go for long duration to test out all of this hardware. Not only would it work now, but would it work 8 days later.
Gemini 5 was the longest manned spaceflight at the time. Its duration of 8 days was calculated to match a flight to the moon and back.
Very early in the flight, we had a bad pressure drop in our oxygen system going to the fuel cell, and we had to do a complete power down in order to fall back and regroup and decide whether we were going to have to abort the mission or whether we could nurse everything back online and get it to working. And fortunately, we managed to get everything finally back online.
The thrusters would clog up, and we would lose thrusters in this axis or that axis, and we'd have to create workarounds in order to use them. So we had, especially during the flights, a tremendous opportunity, now that I can think of it as that way rather than the other, to deal with things that didn't work out as we had planned in terms of hardware, and how are we going to work around it, and how are we going to continue to achieve the mission objectives while we were fumbling with these flooding fuel cells, choking fuel cells, and poor propulsion systems where the thrusters were, sometimes several of them, maybe half of them, would not be operating by the time we got to the end of the flight.
The malfunctioning fuel cell caused a number of scientific experiments to be canceled. As a result, the astronauts experienced a great deal of downtime.
The Gemini 5, I worried about the retro rockets firing. I worried about them for 8 days, and the longer it got, I said I figured if they didn't fire, I'd slit my wrists, because I wanted to get out of there in the worst way.
Pete and I were determined we were going to keep our computer. We had the first really all-up computer. We were going to make sure that computer didn't get blitzed at all during the flight, so we'd keep the computer off, verify that we had the right ground load coming up and everything. So we wanted to shoot the first computer-controlled re-entry. And we figured we were going to hit it right on the bazoom there.
The Gemini computer, of course, looking back on it, was an absolute, it was really archaic compared to what we use today. I mean, it's really archaic. We had a re-entry computer problem. We reloaded it with the wrong parameters, and therefore it flew the wrong profile, and we significantly missed the area totally together.
When we fired retro and started re-entry, I was following the needles and realized we were going in very steeply, much steeper than the nominal that we'd done many, many times in the simulator. I said something is wrong, so I rolled up to where I had maximum lift, and if I hadn't, we'd have been off by 200 miles probably. And what happens is that the ground had made an error in their mathematics. They had us way off on the re-entry calculations, and it was just due to ground calculation error.
The mission was successful in that for the first time, the Americans had finally surpassed the Soviets in a manned space activity, extending the human endurance record to 8 days. It was the mission of the Gemini 6 crew, Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford, to rendezvous and dock with a target vehicle in orbit. The target was called Agena, which was put on top of an Atlas booster rocket. To land a crew on the moon and return them safely to Earth, the Apollo program called for multiple docking events. Spacecraft traveling at speeds of up to 25,000 miles per hour would be required to link up with precise accuracy.
For Apollo 6, we were all just fired up, and we launched the Agena, and the Agena flew up. We couldn't launch the Gemini. And I was 21 years old, and it was sort of a sobering event for me. I was 21 years old, and I thought, these things surely you have to work. And the next thing I know, the Agena is blown up, and then that made me think, that you need to take this business really seriously because other things can happen. This happened to be an unmanned vehicle, but still in all, a lot of people worked really hard to make it work, and it didn't work.
Jim Lovell and I were at the launch at Cape Kennedy for the Agena that was to be the target for Gemini 6. And of course the Agena blew up, and before we left the blockhouse, Chris Kraft and John Yardley and Walter Burke were starting to draw things on the back of an envelope of how they could change the mission and use us for the target vehicle for Gemini 6.
We could launch Gemini 7 and recycle a launch pad. We could launch now Gemini 6 on reverse frequency or reverse timing to do a rendezvous with Gemini 7 as the target vehicle. And we said, wow, that's a great idea, because if we didn't do a mission such as that, be the end of our whole Gemini 6, just scrub it, forget it. And then do a rendezvous possibly with an Agena on Gemini 8, the next flight schedule after 7.
Since there was only one launching pad for the Gemini spacecraft, NASA took on the enormous task of having to arrange for the removal of the Gemini 6 rocket, replacing it with the Gemini 7 rocket, preparing for the Gemini 7 launch, and then recycling the launch pad for the Gemini 6 launch. Because of the power limitations of the Gemini capsules, NASA had to accomplish all of this in less than a week that otherwise would have taken at least 2 to 3 weeks.
Gemini 7's primary mission was to show that you could survive for 14 days in a zero-G environment. And the grueling part of the mission was not simply in flight. For 2 weeks, I think it was 2 weeks, before the flight we had to do a complete analysis of all of our intake and excrement, and we had all kinds of, the doctors were poking needles in at every opportunity. I even launched with EEG needles in my head, so it was it was a difficult situation, but that was the job. One of the things that we got from Gemini 5 was that flying in the spacesuits, the heavier spacesuits, was very debilitating. So we were able to convince NASA, and it wasn't hard, that we should have a lightweight pressure suit, which was developed in a very short period of time, and that was very convenient because we could get out of it, and we did. The lightweight suits we had were almost like inner tubes, so when they inflated, you were like this, and you couldn't move at all, but they would have sufficed for an emergency reentry, and that's all they were for.
Through countdown, all set to go and right on schedule, everything perfectly timed. Bang, the engine started. Didn't keep running. The electronic signal said liftoff. The clocks started. Mission control, launch control, all said liftoff. Old Watashi sitting there said that was not a liftoff. And it was the experience I'd had by having flown on Mercury, on Atlas before. I was sensitized to the noises that I was hearing, and I immediately knew the engines had come up to speed and then gone right back down again. In lieu of shutting down, the thought might be you lift it off and you're about ready to crash back on the launch pad, which would make a rather loud noise. And our alternative there was to eject or pull the D-ring between our legs, much like a fighter pilot would in a fighter aircraft, and eject both of us out simultaneously and come down in parachute. Very much the end of Gemini 6 if that happened.
As it turned out, a sensor plug came loose on ignition, causing the rocket to shut down just as it was firing up. Fortunately, the rocket did not lift off the pad. NASA regrouped, and another restart 3 days later sent Gemini 6 successfully off in pursuit of Gemini 7.
We really were a passive part of that thing. We were the target vehicle for Gemini 6. From our standpoint, it was very, very welcome because it was pretty boring. We were low on fuel, and it gave us an exciting part of the mission.
A lot of the flight controllers, including Chris Kraft and Glenn Lundy, didn't think we could fly formation at night. I said, hey, it's a piece of cake. We had no problem flying formation. And now, today, you see a shuttle docked with mirror, and then they're talking about little teeny tiny decimals of motion with a big vehicle. But we perfected a control system that could do that, and that's essentially what Gemini did. We learned how to use little teeny tiny bursts of power instead of monstrous little tiny micro bursts, I guess we call them, so that you could maneuver the vehicle. And that's what made the beginning of what is today a very common routine.
We flew within 6 inches, 12 inches of one another. Really, the control mode of the Gemini was wonderful. And of course, there's no atmospheric Just there's no wind or gusts or thermals. It really is quite much easier than formation flying with airplanes.
We, in Gemini 6, were the last of the battery-powered Gemini spacecraft. And we then were essentially committed to about a 26-hour mission maximum on Gemini 6 with the batteries. And it's also why the fuel cell was proven out with Gemini 7, because they were up there for 2 weeks. There's no way a battery-powered spacecraft would last that long.
And then it was a hell to pay to try to get Borman and Lovell to stay up there after those guys left. I had to tell them a bedtime story every night for the next couple of nights because the fuel cells were going to pot fast.
This is where Gemini should get more credit, having gone through the agony of making the fuel cell work in space. It had all kinds of anomalies. There have temperature changes, there's some leaks, some of the systems wouldn't come on the line, they wouldn't pressurize. And it took a lot of crew work to do that. So if we hadn't developed the fuel cell, we could not have done the lunar mission. No way.
And about the 10th or 11th day, the old Gemini spacecraft began to get tired. We started losing thrusters. Our fuel cells were acting up. I wasn't certain at all that we could go the 14 days because of mechanical reasons, but the people on the ground did a wonderful job, and I had so much confidence in them when they said we could make it. Well, that was it.
If you sat in a Gemini spacecraft, it would be the equivalent of sitting in the front seat of a Volkswagen with some more stuff in the front seat than a Volkswagen had, especially in the middle. So it's an extremely constrained environment. And God bless those two guys. They spent 2 weeks up there living and working and flying in an environment that's no bigger than that. And they had to do everything that a human being has to do. They had to eat and clean themselves up and take care of their other bodily functions in this really confined space.
Gemini had decided on the Gemini 7 program that we would try to keep one person awake at all times. The ground wanted that also because we didn't have continuous coverage from the ground of radar tracking. So if something went wrong between radar stations, you wanted someone alert to detect it. That turned out to be an impossible task. It's very difficult for one person to sleep when your elbow is touching the next person who's working. And so, to be candid with you, I don't think either one of us slept worth a nickel for 2 weeks. I know I didn't.
Having accomplished a long-duration mission and a rendezvous flight, a docking with a target vehicle was planned for Gemini 8. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and David Scott would crew the mission. Both Gemini 8 and the Atlas Agena target vehicle were launched on March 16, 1966. After Armstrong and Scott successfully docked with the target vehicle, a malfunctioning thruster caused the two spacecraft to spin out of control. Armstrong skillfully undocked the two vehicles without damage, although his spacecraft continued to spin to the point where both men nearly lost consciousness. Without immediate action, the spacecraft would continue to spin out of control and off into outer space.
He had to turn the system off, and now he's sitting there spinning like hell to the point where he's going to lose consciousness if he doesn't do something, because you begin to lose consciousness at those kind of rates. So then he said, I've got all the attitude control system off. Now how am I going to cure it? How am I going to stop it? I got to turn on my entry control system. Right? So he breaks the seal on the entry control system, stops the motion, stabilizes it, but now we've broken our mission rule, which says if you ever break the attitude control system on the re-entry package, you got to come down ASAP.
But that was a harrowing experience because we basically had to use the entry rocket system to be able to control and stabilize the thing on orbit. and we wound up landing in a contingency landing area. That was a harrowing experience I remember from Gemini 8.
It turned out that they did that right at the middle of Batman, and ABC or whoever had Batman on interrupted the Batman story to talk about Neil and Dave making this re-entry, and all the people got very torqued off that they had interrupted Batman to tell them that these guys had to splash down in the middle of the Pacific and float around for a couple hours till a destroyer could come pick them up.
The next mission, Gemini 9, was racked with misfortune and tragedy from the beginning. The prime crew of Elliot C. and Charles Bassett were killed in an airplane crash at St. Louis on February 28, 1966, just 2 months before launch. This marked the first time in NASA history that a crew had to be replaced. As a result, backup crewman Tom Stafford and Eugene Cernan entered the Gemini 9 spacecraft on the morning of May 17, 1966, only to climb out when the target Agena vehicle exploded on launch. NASA had prepared a secondary target vehicle in anticipation of such a scenario, but this vehicle ultimately failed to shed its payload shrouds covering the docking collar, and thus prevented any docking. Although nothing went according to plan during this Gemini mission, hope still hung on a highly anticipated EVA. NASA was confident of its pending success, especially after the perfectly executed EVA performed by Ed White during the Gemini 4 mission.
But the fact is, we thought EVA was a piece of cake. And then we went out on Gemini 9 with Gene Cernan, tried another EVA. This one here was more aggressive. We had a manned maneuvering unit in the back end of the adapter area. And we asked Gene to take and deploy the arms, and he was going to fly to separate this manned maneuvering unit from the Gemini spacecraft. And this is only the second EVA we'd ever done, and he had difficulty. We learned about space welding. The pieces wouldn't move, and he did a lot of work. We didn't know anything about restraints at that time. He started to perspire heavily. His faceplate fogged over because we hadn't invented anti-fog compounds at that time until finally, almost blinded, they had to come back into the spacecraft.
So it again was kind of a spooky experience, and as a matter of fact, later we found out that Gene even ripped part of his suit on an antenna back there that he had inadvertently broken, because he was not able to see very well. So again, we learned, and by the way, felt that we were being smiled on and watched over by someone smarter than us, because any of the things that we had run into could have turned out much worse than they did.
Public concern and congressional support showed increasing signs of waning with the difficulties and failures encountered throughout the Gemini program. Safety issues, thought to be brought on by the rapid pace of the program, were becoming increasingly hard for NASA to justify. The future of the space race and the entire NASA organization presently rested with the Gemini 10. Crewmates John Young and Michael Collins now held the very fate of the moon race in their hands.
We're supposed to rendezvous with this one Agena and use a propulsion system on the Agena to go up and do an extravehicular activity to the next Agena that we rendezvoused with and retrieve a meteorite package that had been up there for many months.
That was a very exciting mission because, you know, we set a high altitude record and went a long ways with a spacecraft that was not all that robust. So it was an exciting mission. We all had our fingers crossed about doing that kind of thing for the first time in a way that we knew the subsystems had to work, propulsion systems had to work just exactly to be able to come back. We all had our fingers crossed on that particular mission. So the thing I remember about that is not only the The exciting aspect of setting that altitude record, but the thing I remember from that was the photographs and to hear them describe what the Earth looked like.
Anything we took a picture of on the ground in Mercury, Gemini in the early Apollo days, we could not release any of those photographs until the DOD had looked at them. And they withdrew. They took out all the pictures of anything that we took a picture of that they didn't want us to show. They did not want to show the capability that you had from space of looking at the enemy.
The only negative aspect of this entire mission was when the EVA of Michael Collins was cut short because of an unexplained contamination in the air supply system that caused the eyes of both Collins and Young to water. Almost nothing could be accomplished in the EVA by Collins, even though the mission as a whole proved to be a resounding success.
It worked out okay. It worked out very well. It was a good mission. And matter of fact, up till that time, the Gemini program was in a heap of trouble. Everything we'd done hadn't worked out too well, and we were getting a lot of negative reviews from everybody, and Gemini 10 sort of turned it around, I think.
Gemini 11, with its crew, Pete Conrad and Dick Gordon, lifted off on September 12, 1966, just 97 minutes after their Agena target rocket was launched into orbit. Conrad successfully maneuvered the spacecraft into a first orbit rendezvous over the Hawaiian Islands, just 84 minutes after leaving the pad. 10 minutes later, he docked with Agena over the state of Texas. Once again, NASA attempted an aggressive spacewalk schedule, this time with rookie astronaut Dick Gordon.
Houston, roger. Shoot, the voice recorder's on. Voice recorder's on now. We're 9 minutes, 50 seconds into the evening. Dick's sitting on the nose breathing. How you doing? I'm breathing hard. Yeah? Well, just relax.
We had this, Dick was really a heavy breather, I guess you would say, and he sounded like he was in a sprint the whole time he was out there. He was trying to straddle the front end of the spacecraft, on the nose of the spacecraft, because he was hooking up a tether.
Both cameras are running. How you doing? Well, I'm here. Huh? I'm here, I guess. Sure are. Right up, cowboy. Now, why don't you just sit down and take a rest?
After we undocked from the Agena stage, we had a tether hooking the Gemini vehicle and the Agena together, and frankly, in retrospect, we probably didn't know what the hell we were doing. But we had these things, and we were trying to experiment with spinning the combination up so that you could see how well tethers worked and how well you controlled the vehicles and so on.
It was Cernan's flight and his flight that made us say, well, look, we don't understand EVA. We don't understand how to work in space. So we better go do what we can on the ground to build some kind of simulator to show us what we can do and can't do, and what tools and what devices and help we've got to give the astronaut in order for him to do the job. And that's what we did between 10 and 12.
I began to see that crew members were having difficulty with the floating environment called spacewalking in controlling the mass and the inertia and trying to establish some friction and some point of leverage. You can't just muscle your body around. It's not a question of brute force at all. It's a question of very, very delicate actions that are done by getting Mother Nature to work with you.
And somebody, I don't know who it was, came up with the idea of, hey, let's use this thing called neutral buoyancy training. And Buzz Aldrin came in. He was one of the first crew members to be trained in a neutral buoyancy facility.
By the time I came along, it was nice to have the underwater training environment, but with the foot restraints, I think we could have understood and performed in EVA reasonably well. It's just that the underwater environment that was offered to me to be the first person to train underwater just came along sort of by coincidence with my experience having been a scuba diver. I was very open and welcomed this training method.
During the EVA on later Apollo missions, astronauts would walk the lunar surface, conduct experiments, and experience the moon's environment. Up to this point, however, the EVA had not yet been perfected, as evidenced by the numerous problems encountered on Gemini 9, 10, and 11. Gemini 12 was now NASA's last chance. Should they fail or experience difficulties akin to the earlier missions, the whole of the plans for Apollo would be affected. Crewmates Buzz Aldrin and Jim Lovell lifted off on November 11, 1966.
By the end of the program, and was probably the first flight where we didn't have the fogging problem and the overloading of the air conditioning system that they carried on their chest, cooling system. And so we didn't get till the end of the program until the EVA was begun to be understood and we began to learn how to train for it, we began to learn how to execute them, and that was the thing that gave us a lot of confidence for going to the moon on Apollo.
Buzz Aldrin came through with flying colors. A record 5 hours and 38 minutes of EVA was accomplished to Gemini 12's credit. The flight of Gemini 12 ended on Tuesday, November 15, 1966, and with it, so ended Project Gemini. As a result of these 10 Gemini missions over a period of just 20 months, America had logged over 4,000 man-hours in space and gained more knowledge of hardware in the human body in space than through any other project to date in the history of NASA. By comparison, the Russians totaled only 500 hours in space and did not even report a single launch throughout the entire time of Project Gemini. Many historians feel that this sudden lack of progress was a result of Khrushchev's insistence on performing space stunts at the expense of genuine technological progress and engineering development, as well as his replacement's lack of vision in space exploration.
The success we had in Apollo was a direct result of the experience base and the confidence that we developed during the Gemini program. There was no way possible that we could have skipped from 4 little Mercury flights to go into the moon on the second manned Apollo flight. And it was that confidence base that we had in the people who had been through the training ground of Gemini that allowed us to transition to Apollo and get on with the landing as quickly as we did. I mean, it was a gangbusters, can-do, aggressive, somewhat brash group of people that came out of the Gemini experience.
If we hadn't have done it, we wouldn't have had the operational experience to go to the moon. And that experience was critical. There are people within the program at NASA that didn't think it was critical, but they don't know anything about how human beings work together and how they have to interact and what experience they have to gain to do things. So I'm not sure the general public needs to know about that either. I mean, but it was important. If we hadn't have done it, we would never have been able to land on the moon in 1969.
Although Gemini missions never flew to the moon, those 10 flights provided NASA with the technical knowledge and expertise necessary to eventually send astronauts successfully to the lunar surface and back. Gemini had built the bridge to the moon, and in just a year and a half, the table had completely turned on the Soviets. Project Gemini provided a sense of security to Americans and fledgling democracies around the world, as NASA effectively catapulted the United States ahead of the Soviet Union in the race to the moon.
I think that what happened in the space program in the 60s was one of the really great things this country had going for it, and it probably kept it together. It was the one thing that the country could show its pride in. Wasn't very much going on otherwise for that during that time period. I've felt that way very strongly about it. And I think we contributed a great deal to the outlook of the country, and there's no question we contributed tremendously to the technological advantage that the country had in the 70s based on the technology we developed in the 60s.
The accomplishments and achievements of Project Gemini were quickly overshadowed by the more glamorous lunar missions of Apollo. With the end of the decade rapidly approaching, NASA had no time to rest. Within 3 years, former Gemini astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would be the first human beings to walk on the moon. Without Project Gemini, the flag that was first planted on the moon would most certainly have belonged to the Soviet Union. Perhaps Gemini's greatest legacy is the space technology that was developed and perfected during the 10 missions, most of which is still in use today on shuttle missions and in the building of the International Space Station. In essence, the entire space station and the future of humanity in space will stand on the shoulders of the astronauts, NASA officials, and engineers that made Project Gemini possible.